The midday sun glared through the windows, illuminating the crowded economy cabin. Ethan Ward, a single father, sat rigidly in 11C. Next to him, Lucas clutched his worn backpack, watching the bright sky. Up front, a distinct commotion started in business class. The famous CEO, Victoria Hale, was loudly disputing service with a flight attendant. She spun, her dismissive gaze fixed on Ethan and Lucas. Her cold, cutting remark was perfectly audible. "Flights like this really aren't for people with kids." Lucas immediately lowered his head. Ethan gently squeezed his son's hand. Suddenly, the sharp, urgent chime from the cockpit sliced through the manufactured silence. The man was Ethan Ward, 38, and currently defined only by his seat number, 11C. To the world, he was utterly invisible, a single father whose life for the last 7 years had been a relentless exercise in monastic discipline and deliberate obscurity. His posture, a habit of keeping the spine ramrod straight, the shoulders back, the gaze steady, was the only lingering physical evidence of his previous life. Ethan had once been Major Ethan Maverick Ward, an elite FA-18 combat instructor whose tactical development records and flight logs were classified at the highest level. His combat experience wasn't measured in flights, but in engagements, moments of critical decision-making where precision meant the difference between life and death. That life, a world of high G turns, supersonic physics, and unwavering protocol, ended abruptly following a catastrophic, personal crisis that demanded his absolute presence on the ground. His wife had passed away suddenly, leaving him with an infant and a choice. He had exchanged the boundless sky and military honor for the quiet, predictable rhythm of school drop-offs and low-profile, remote consulting jobs. The sacrifice was total. The anonymity was his only true reward. He needed Lucas to have a normal life, a safe life, far removed from the inherent chaos and danger of his former existence. Lucas, 8 years old, was the precise center of this new protected world. This flight, a commercial red-eye to the West Coast, was a necessary evil. It was required to start a new well-paying contract that promised to finally build the financial security Ethan desperately wanted for his son. He was acutely accustomed to the judgmental glances, his faded, unbranded jacket, his carefully repaired backpack, and his air of quiet, self-contained competence often clashed violently with the expensive, superficial setting of the corporate world he now briefly entered. He wore the scrutiny, the social dismissal, like a ghost limb. It was present, but it held no weight for him. Victoria Hale, the source of the recent friction, was the CEO of Hale Aerospace Logistics, a multi-billion-dollar firm that consulted heavily on infrastructure and air traffic management with commercial aviation clients worldwide. She was 40, powerful, and deeply entrenched in a culture of entitlement. Victoria was accustomed to private charters, customized routes, and a world that bent effortlessly to her schedule and demands. She viewed any commercial setback, a delay, a cramped seat, poor Wi-Fi, as a personal affront to her status. For Victoria, the economy cabin was simply another world, a noisy, inefficient space filled with people whose lack of financial value, she believed, was often reflected in their public behavior. Her cold, cutting remark was not truly aimed at Ethan as an individual, but at the inefficiency of having children occupy space she deemed premium. It was an abstract, generalized cruelty. The brief, cutting sentence hung in the air, a visible wave of radiating contempt. A few nearby passengers visibly flinched, their faces registering momentary disapproval, but none dared to challenge the powerful, famous woman in business class. Silence was easier than confrontation. Ethan felt the familiar, hot rush of anger. He didn't need to look at Lucas to know the damage was done. His priority was his son's fragile peace. The pain was not for himself. He was immune to civilian slights, but for the sudden devastation in his son's small 8-year-old face. Lucas finally whispered, his voice tiny and wounded. "Did I make her mad, Dad? Should I have just stayed home?" Ethan gently placed his palm firmly on Lucas's shoulder, a gesture of unwavering stability and communication he had developed over years. He did not immediately answer. He had stopped teaching Lucas to react to external pressure years ago. Instead, his life lesson was composure, the fighter pilot's primary asset. Observation first, patience always. You do not respond until you are absolutely certain of the facts, and that certainty requires clarity. He taught his son to hold the line, to be still, and to wait for the undeniable moment when silence could speak louder than any argument. The quiet dignity of his silence was the only armor he allowed himself to wear now. He looked down and gave Lucas a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of the head. No, you did not make her mad. She was mad before she saw you. The plane finished its taxi and paused at the edge of the runway, the engines spooling up to full military power for the takeoff run. Ethan stared out the window, his expression impassive, mentally locking down the surge of rage. He focused on the familiar, powerful vibration of the twin engines, a predictable rhythm. He just needed to survive this flight, a quiet, uneventful journey to the other side of the country. The flight ascended rapidly, the massive engines roaring until the aircraft pushed quickly through the cloud layers and leveled out at a steady cruise altitude of 37,000 feet. The cabin lights dimmed to a soothing hue, and the rhythm of the cabin staff slowed into the predictable, quiet service of a long flight. However, the peace was manufactured. Victoria Hale, clearly still agitated, continued a low-level, pointed conversation with her executive assistant seated beside her. Her voice carried, full of thinly veiled disgust, aimed squarely at the cramped conditions and poor filtration of the economy section. Her scornful gaze would occasionally sweep back, ensuring Ethan and Lucas knew their presence was still an inconvenience, a noise pollution to her premium experience. Lucas was unnaturally quiet. He kept his small model jet, a rare, cherished gift from his father, hidden deep in his backpack, refusing to touch his sketchbook. He was mastering stillness, minimizing his profile to avoid any further notice. A small boy trying to become invisible. Ethan, though, was no longer focused on the CEO's petty drama. His entire attention had shifted entirely to the airframe itself. He was listening, utilizing a lifetime of training where his senses were extensions of the machine he flew. A fighter pilot's body learns the precise, stable hum of a perfectly functioning airframe. Any deviation is a threat. It began subtly, a faint, rhythmic oscillation. Not the heavy, unpredictable lurch of clear air turbulence, which pushes the whole plane, but a high-frequency tremble, a mechanical tremor familiar only to those who had pushed high-performance metal to its absolute breaking point. It felt wrong. It was metallic, rotational, and unnervingly constant, a low-grade, persistent shudder that lay beneath the roar of the engines. This was the symptom of systemic imbalance, likely a failing component within the engine's massive turbine blade, or, far worse, a high-pressure line feeding the primary flight control actuators. Ethan shifted in his seat, his muscles tensed beneath his jacket. He pressed his hands against the plastic armrests, trying to feel the exact vector of the vibration through the seat mount, triangulating its source. It wasn't intermittent, it was persistent, a continuous, minute vibration that the civilian pilots, accustomed to automated stability and noise-canceling headsets, might easily overlook as standard airframe resonance. Ethan knew better. This was the sound of something fighting against its own design. His mind immediately began running the emergency checklist, an automatic high-speed diagnostic sequence refined over thousands of training hours. Input: high-frequency lateral shudder, pitch, nominal, yaw, minor drift. Hypothesis 1, compressor stall precursor, ruled out, engine sound is too regular. Hypothesis 2, control surface flutter, possible given the metallic pitch. The specific pitch of the metallic whine, faintly peaking and dipping with the engine's automated throttle adjustments, was the critical input. It confirmed a terrifying hypothesis. They were bleeding pressure somewhere critical, likely a primary hydraulic circuit, leading to an actuator failure on the control surfaces. He briefly, almost involuntarily, recalled the Tucson incident 7 years ago, a training exercise where he had to bring an FA-18 home with nearly half its vertical stabilizer sheared off by debris. The controls then had been equally sloppy, equally resistant, but he had the benefit of a fully aware system and a co-pilot. Here he was a passenger, separated from the controls by layers of bureaucracy and two closed doors, relying on the reaction time of a commercial crew who likely lacked the raw, seat-of-the-pants training needed for this kind of catastrophic failure. The knowledge that he, the most qualified person, was rendered inert by his own protective choice created a terrifying internal tension. Silence protects Lucas. Intervention saves everyone else. The weight of that decision pressed down on him, heavier than any G-force he had ever pulled. Then a minor physical sign that confirmed Ethan's fears. The plane gave a clean, sickening lurch downward, maybe 50 feet, before the autopilot wrenched it back. It was not a drop from clear air turbulence. It was a mechanical failure in maintaining altitude. The airframe groaned under the sudden corrective load. A brief clipped announcement came from the cockpit, masked in technical calm. "We are noting a minor instrument indication on the control display. We are initiating a brief descent to optimize flight parameters." Optimize. Ethan mentally translated. "We have lost control authority on a primary flight surface, and the computer is compensating frantically, burning altitude to ease the aerodynamic load." The control loss was starting, and it was accelerating. Victoria Hale, who had also felt the lurch, leaned over to her assistant, her voice now sharp with genuine irritation, not just disdain. "What is wrong with this airline? They can't even hold altitude. I will have a conversation with the board the moment we land." Ethan barely registered her. He was trapped by his own choice. His duty, his military code, the essence of the major, demanded he intervene instantly, that he warn the crew about the rapidly escalating structural and control failure. But to intervene meant tearing down the wall of anonymity he had painstakingly built to protect Lucas. It meant sacrificing the quiet life. He was a weapon, safely sheathed, but his sheath was the peace of his son. The metallic screech grew slightly louder, a deadly silent metronome ticking toward disaster beneath the veneer of the commercial cabin. Ethan was holding his breath, waiting for the undeniable, catastrophic sign that would force his hand, the single terrifying trigger that would shock the complacent world outside his discipline and demand the return of Major Ward. If you'd like to see how this moment unfolds, you're welcome to subscribe and continue with us. The cabin's manufactured piece shattered without preamble. Not with a noise, but with a terrifying, instantaneous collapse of the aircraft's stability. A jarring, triple-tone alert. Not the chime for service, but a harsh, insistent, catastrophic alarm sounded throughout the aircraft. Immediately, the cabin lights flashed violently, flickering and dying entirely, plunging the plane into a brief, sickening darkness before the emergency strip lights struggled back on. The aircraft pitched sharply, a sudden, sickening drop of hundreds of feet, followed by a hard, uncontrolled, lateral yaw that threw unbuckled passengers and loose items violently against the ceiling and the walls. The airframe groaned audibly, the sound of stressed metal reaching its ultimate, terrifying limit. Panic flared instantly in the economy cabin, a wave of desperate, high-pitched screams. The flight attendants, pale but professional, began rushing down the aisle, their voices strained but firm. "Secure your belongings. Stay seated. Head down." Their practiced composure was gone, replaced by the raw tension of professionals who knew they were in a genuine life-or-death emergency. A short technical announcement followed, the captain's voice noticeably strained and breathless. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing an intense airframe stability issue. We are working the checklist. Please remain buckled." Then the intercom went dead. The subsequent silence from the flight deck was deafening. It meant the pilots had completely lost their ability to multitask, their hands fully occupied wrestling the dying machine. The plane began a chaotic, plunging descent, corkscrewing slightly as the pilots fought the sluggish, failing controls. Loose cabin equipment rattled loudly. Lucas gripped his father's arm tightly, bearing his face into Ethan's side, trembling uncontrollably. "Dad, I'm scared. What's happening?" Ethan closed his eyes for a short, crucial 5 seconds, running a final, Full mental diagnostic of the shudder, the pitch, the failed stabilization. The vibration was now a violent, high-pitched rattle. The primary control authority was failing rapidly. They were out of time. He opened his eyes, the tired father gone, replaced by the steely-eyed major. The internal chime rang again, a single, long, authoritative blast. It cut through the screams and the rattle. The subsequent voice was not the calm, professional tone of the captain, but a man speaking live, his voice deep, strained, and filled with a desperate terminal urgency. He spoke with a terrifying lack of pretense, broadcasting a plea that stripped away all the layers of commercial aviation formality and professional pride. This is the captain. We are in a critical control failure state, losing hydraulics and actuator pressure. My first officer has been incapacitated due to a sudden medical emergency, and I require immediate assistance in maintaining manual stability and differential thrust control. His voice caught, heavy with the weight of 200 lives. I need someone with highly specific, non-commercial flight training, someone capable of flying a dead airframe on pure engine input. The air in the cabin became instantly colder, thicker. Every single person, all 200 passengers, froze, turning their heads simultaneously, searching for a sign, a uniform, a savior. The question hung in the charged atmosphere, an impossible, absurd plea ripped from a wartime film. A fighter pilot? Then the captain's voice returned, the question undeniable, shattering the final facade of normalcy. Are there any fighter pilots on board? Victoria Hale, the CEO, sitting inches away in business class, had been paralyzed, her expression raw terror. Her terror transformed into absolute stunned horror. She expected a uniformed hero to appear from the back, not the impossible silence that followed. She stared wide-eyed at the cockpit door. In the quiet, unremarkable economy cabin, seat 11C finally moved. Ethan Ward slowly, deliberately reached down and unlatched his seatbelt. The small metallic click echoed like a gunshot in the silent cabin, drawing every eye instantly to him. He stood up slowly, the movement deliberate, measured. He wore only a simple, faded jacket and the tired expression of a single father, but his posture, his bearing, was instantly military. The disguise was shed. The operator had returned. He leaned across the aisle passenger, addressing the stunned flight attendant, the same one Victoria had dismissed earlier, with a voice perfectly steady, economical, and authoritative. His voice was calm, cutting through the residual fear. My name is Ethan Ward, former major, call sign Maverick, FA-18 instructor pilot. Tell the captain I'm coming. I have the hours he needs. He did not wait for confirmation. He moved swiftly, efficiently into the aisle. His steps were not rushed, but every movement was imbued with a terrifying, purposeful focus. He was walking toward the fire. Lucas looked up, tears suddenly held in check, his small face a mask of awe and confusion. He saw a stranger in his father's clothes, a man who was not merely dad, but a force of singular, terrifying purpose. The boy watched as the quiet, anonymous man, who had just been publicly scorned, became the only lifeline for 200 souls. Victoria Hale, mere feet away, watched him pass. Her mind, built on judging human value and net worth, raced with a horrifying realization. The ridicule she had offered hours ago died instantly on her lips, replaced by a cold, chilling understanding. She had just mocked the only man who possessed the specific, unique skill set that could save her life. Ethan Ward disappeared behind the closed business class curtain, ushered forward by the flight attendant with a mixture of terror and sudden, blinding reverence. The heavy door to the cockpit sealed shut, locking him into the critical phase of the emergency. The economy cabin remained submerged in a heavy, paralyzed silence. The shock of the captain's call had been replaced by the profound, terrifying realization that their fate rested entirely on the quiet father from 11C. Inside the cockpit, the struggle was immediate and brutal. Captain Reynolds, sweating and shaking from the exertion of fighting the dead controls, looked up as Ethan entered. No time for pleasantries. Control column is sluggish. Rudder feels dead. Primary hydraulics are zero. Flaps are stuck. Ethan immediately took the co-pilot's seat, his hands finding the yoke and controls as if they were extensions of his own body. I'm taking over primary inputs. You handle thrust control and comms. We are flying this thing on the engines. He slammed his palm down on the console, shouting over the relentless, howling alarm. Captain, shut down all non-essential electrics. We need maximum power to the engine response regulators now. Kill the passenger entertainment systems. There was a microsecond of hesitation from Reynolds. The checklist. Forget the checklist, Ethan snapped, his voice sharp and absolute. This is a tactical failure, not a systems failure. We're running differential thrust only. You control the power, Captain. I'll control the pitch and yaw. Ethan grabbed the manual trim wheel, a small, seemingly insignificant dial, and began cranking it with brutal focused strength. The plane's nose was bucking violently, forcing him to fight every inch of control. This was not the smooth, computer-aided input of a commercial flight. This was raw, physical engineering. The trim wheel is now the primary elevator. He used the differential thrust, manipulating the power of the two massive jet engines independently, to steer the nose of the plane, coupled with the manual trim inputs. He was banking and stabilizing the jet with pure physics and instinct, bypassing the primary hydraulic failures. This was a maneuver taught only in military flight schools, the last-ditch effort to keep a heavily loaded airframe from spiraling out of the sky when every conventional system failed. They were not flying. They were wrestling a piece of dying metal into submission using pure physics and instinct. Victoria Hale sat utterly motionless in her plush business-class seat. Her fear was visceral, but the internal collapse of her arrogance was greater. Every second was an indictment of her previous contempt. The cockpit door, the sealed vault containing the fate of everyone, became the single terrifying focus of her existence. Her highly paid credentials, her billion-dollar firm, her entire hierarchy of success meant absolutely nothing in this moment. Her life was entirely dependent on the man she had dismissed as an inconvenience. He brought a child on the flight. He was a distraction. The irony was suffocating, a grotesque cosmic joke. Lucas in 11C sat perfectly straight, clutching his backpack. He did not move, his eyes fixed on the gap where the cockpit door met the wall. The fear was tempered by a confusing, overwhelming sense of pride. He saw the dad who packed his lunch transform into something powerful, something essential, the protector of the world. Time crawled, marked only by the irregular groan of the airframe and the high-pitched metallic rattle. The plane continued its rapid descent, but the chaotic, spiraling motion had eased. The airframe was heavy, the controls were sluggish, but the movements were steady, controlled, and intentional. Ethan was winning the fight. Finally, a welcome voice cut through the cabin, no longer the captain's strained urgency, but the clear, professional tone of the senior flight attendant, acting as the new radio operator, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed relief. Ladies and gentlemen, the control issue has been successfully stabilized. We are continuing our emergency descent to a nearby alternate airfield. Please remain fully secured. We are now in a controlled state. A controlled state. That single phrase, quiet and professional, brought the collective release of breath that no cheering could ever capture. The emotional response was primal. Deep, silent sobs, the shaking of hands, the painful slackening of tense muscles. No one clapped. They had simply been pulled back from the edge of oblivion by an unseen hand. The shift in the cabin was palpable. Every eye that glanced toward the cockpit door now held nothing but profound, humbling respect. The judgment was gone. The scorn was annihilated. Victoria Hale slowly lowered her head, not daring to meet anyone's gaze. She had judged a book by its cover, and that cover had just become the shield that saved her life. 30 minutes later, the plane executed a heavy, lurching, but ultimately safe landing at a remote airfield. The cabin remained silent until the jet came to a complete stop, the silence broken only by the sound of emergency vehicles rushing toward them outside. Ethan Ward, his face streaked with sweat, his clothes disheveled, was the last person to emerge from the cockpit alongside the exhausted Captain Reynolds. Ethan's eyes were clear, focused, and deeply tired. He walked back down the aisle, his pace measured, not seeking recognition, just slipping back into his anonymity as he passed the silent, grateful passengers. He reached seat 11C. Lucas looked up at him, his small face a mixture of awe and dawning understanding. You're, you're a pilot, Dad? Lucas whispered, the question heavy with new information. Ethan sat down, buckling his seatbelt. He placed a steadying hand on his son's knee. I was trained to protect people, buddy, he confirmed softly, his voice full of a quiet conviction. That's all that matters now. Before Ethan could unbuckle Lucas, Victoria Hale stood up. The CEO, stripped of her context, was just a pale, shaking woman. She walked slowly toward their row, the attention of the entire economy cabin focused on her. She did not offer a compensation package or a job offer. She simply stood before Ethan and Lucas, her posture straight, her tone devoid of all artifice and condescension. Mr. Ward, she began, her voice cracking slightly, I owe you my life, and the life of everyone here. My behavior earlier was unforgivable. It was arrogant, cruel, and profoundly ignorant. She paused, struggling to maintain her composure. I saw only an inconvenience and a seat number. I didn't see the man. I didn't see the immense skill. I am deeply sorry. She looked down at Lucas, tears welling in her eyes. And I apologize to you, young man. Your father is a true, silent hero. She did not wait for a response. She gave a single respectful nod, a gesture stripped of all corporate rank, and walked toward the open exit door. No one paid attention to her expensive clothes. They only saw a fellow passenger who had been humbled by competence. The evacuation began, quiet and orderly. Ethan and Lucas were among the last to step out onto the tarmac. As they walked toward the makeshift terminal, Ethan looked down at his son, who was holding his head higher than he had at the start of the trip. Never let where you sit define who you are, Lucas, Ethan murmured, the lesson proven on a global scale. Humility is always more important than altitude. The most capable person in the world is often the one you choose to ignore. They merged with the grateful silent crowd, the former fighter pilot and his son, disappearing back into the safety of their quiet life on the ground. True value does not require a challenge to be proven, only the humility to be seen. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe. Respect doesn't shout, it reveals itself.